Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 54, Farewell, My Lovely, by Raymond Chandler. And welcome back, Point Blank listeners. My name is Kurt. Joining me once again, it's Justin. Hi, Justin.
Hey, Kurt. Hey, fellow and sister Point Blankers. How are you doing today, Kurt?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. We just moved again, our second move in the times of COVID. Kind of getting settled in. I do feel like, after reading Chandler today, I do kind of feel like my apartment back in the day would have fit into a Raymond Chandler novel, just because of our location and the original build of the apartment is pretty much right on the nose for the time. We're near the docks. There's a train track not too far away, but thankfully it's been updated. Yep, it's a new place to record, so we'll hopefully there's not too much background noise for you all. How you doing, Justin?
I'm pretty good. I'm glad that you've moved into your new place. It sounds like like you said, a little more of a hard-boiled joint than the last one. If you drink about a bottle of liquor a day, you can almost be Philip Marlowe.
Yeah, I'm gonna not do that. Sometimes you got to wonder when you're reading a Marlowe novel just how bad of an alcoholic he is, because we'll get into that during the episode, but
we will.
He sure puts him back.
I think Chandler is mirroring himself in the creation of Marlowe there, because we know he likes to drink when he's writing his novels. So, but to answer your original question, I'm doing well. I went to the grocery store today, and you know how pandemic grocery store shopping is. It's always a little weird.
Yes. It's
a nice winter day here. It's a Friday. I'm feeling fairly confident that I'll have a decent weekend, some time off. And it's been fun to spend a little time with Chandler again. The first time we reviewed him in any detail was with The Big Sleep, which was back in our third episode, 2017. So it's been a while, and it's actually surprising to me to think that we haven't really spent any time thinking about this guy in 3 years. I'm excited about what we're going to think about him after all that time, having read what we've read, the hundreds of books we've read since then. Where does Chandler stand? How does he rate in what is known to be one of his best novels, Farewell, My Lovely?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, those are all good questions to get into during our discussion today, but not to spoil my answers, but it felt refreshing to come back to Chandler and pick up one of these classic works and just feel immersed in the hard-boiled world of Philip Marlowe once again. So it was a real treat, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And would you like me to do my summary/review?
Sure. Yeah, let's dive right into it. Tell us all what this book is about. And I think I will say, listeners, that, this book is 81 years old this year, so we will be spoiling it. And I think I think with Chandler, it's not, there is a twist in his work, but this is something that you very much come along for the ride, and it's a good ride. So yeah, tell us what happens, Justin.
All right, and there's a lot of twists and turns, and I'm not going to download the entire plot narrative into your heads. Many of you already know it, but I'll give the gist. I'll go into detail here and there like I do. So, Farewell, My Lovely. This is a novel written by Raymond Chandler. It was published in 1940. This is his second novel. The first one was The Big Sleep, which, like I said, we reviewed back in 2017. This features private detective Philip Marlowe. It's regarded by many as his finest work. Other people would argue that The Big Sleep or one of the others stands the test of time. But this one, I've read again and again, seems to be one of, if not the pinnacle of his contribution to hard-boiled detective literature. It was A pleasure, like I've said, to return to his work. He's an interesting writer. He obviously set the tone for and the template for what hard-boiled detective fiction looks like in novel form, more so than most. And obviously he was inspirational to hundreds upon thousands of people who either love the ambiance, film noir inspired by him and Humphrey Bogart, and countless writers, some of whom hone a little too closely to the Marlowe mold, but many who use it as a jump-off point to create their own beautiful work. So the plot seemed fairly simple at first through Chandler, but the reality is Chandler's plots are never really simple, and that's one of the reasons why, is that he's always stitching together his short stories. He did it for The Big Sleep. He also does it for Farewell, My Lovely. In this one, Marlowe falls into an acquaintance with a big ol' hunk of a man named Moose Malloy. This is in the first couple pages. He's recently out of prison, Moose is, and Marlowe's actually at this club looking for somebody else, but that's really just a red herring. We end up seeing Moose. Moose drags Marlowe into Moose's own situation. And that situation is this: he's at this club looking for his long-lost girlfriend, Velma. And Velma was his partner 8 years ago. Malloy goes to prison. He comes back looking for her, and he's trying to locate her. It's hard to find her. So we end up at a black-owned liquor joint in downtown Los Angeles. Moose is kind of myopic and doesn't know his own strength. He is insistent that he find Velma. He ends up killing a guy at the bar, a black guy, and we might bring this up again. I say it intentionally because there's some not-so-subtle racism or acquiescence to not respecting the right of black lives in this novel. I don't want to make a hard point of it now. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, Velma's not there. Marlowe gets tangled up with the LAPD, who come in after Malloy has hit the road, and Marlowe decides to track down the wife of the late former owner of the bar, a woman named Jessie Florian, to sort of get more information about where Velma might be. I really enjoy the Jessie Florian character. She lives in squalor, drinking her life away, and has a tragic beauty and presence that lingers long after her scenes have passed. She was one of my favorite characters in the novel, and also in the 1975 film version of the book. Marlowe gets a call then from a guy named Marriott, who's asking for Marlowe's assistance for a ransom payment for some stolen pieces of jade jewelry. This is like the secondary plot. Of course, they all come together, but these are the two calls that sort of set up. We have the Moose and Velma thing, and then we have the Marriott and the piece of stolen jade line of plotting. Marlowe agrees to be the support for this Marriott dude as he tries to get his jade jewelry back. And it doesn't go too well. Marlowe gets sapped in the back of the head and left for dead in a canyon. He doesn't die. He comes to. But he realizes during this transaction that Marriott has also been attacked, but he was killed. We learn later that Jessie Florian was receiving regular paychecks from the guy Marriott, who also owned the deed to her house. So that's how this stuff starts to link together. Pieces fall into place. But many questions remain unanswered. Was there actually a jewel theft? Was Marlowe being set up? If so, by whom? And why? Before leaving the murder scene, Marlowe snags from Marriott's pocket a cigarette case containing 3 marijuana cigarettes. This might be a link to some answers. We don't know. Perhaps it's just a red herring. There's also another character involved around this time, a woman named Anne Riordan, who happens upon the scene and helps Marlowe. She's sort of like his little sleuth. We learn from Riordan that her father was a cop and she was in the area. She knows, she has some familiarity with Marriott and ultimately tangles herself up in this a little bit. Moving on, Marlowe ends up talking with Lieutenant Randall, who comes across as one of the less vile LA cops. It turns out that the necklace made of jade belonged to a Mrs. Grail, who is the young wife of a wealthy man named, Mr. Grail. Marlowe visits the Grail estate, and Mrs. Grail takes a liking to Marlowe, flirts with him. They end up sort of hanging out and getting touchy-feely. Mr. Grail sees this but doesn't seem to care, or he bites his tongue. It's just a little bit awkward what's happening here. There's some power dynamics. This is still early in the story. Like I said, we have a lot of characters and a lot of red herrings, so Chandler sets up a really interesting, complex situation for those who like to solve the mystery, who like to be the detectives as readers. Later on, Marlowe cuts open one of the cigarette filters and finds a business card belonging to a local psychic and mystic weirdo named Jules Amthor. Marlowe visits Amthor, and the visit doesn't go very well. He gets beat up. He gets beaten down by Amthor's racist, stereotype Native American muscle man who goes by the name of Second Planning. I don't even want to talk about that right now. He gets dragged out by two off-duty Bay City policemen and wakes up in the cell at a hospital or a wherever. He doesn't really know. But it's actually a place run by Dr. Sonderborg. And Marlowe's been heavily drugged. We don't know what it was. Maybe it was dope, heroin, whatever. But he fights his way out of the facility. And on his way out, he spots Moose Malloy in one of the cells sort of hanging out. So again, connections occur. Moose has been spotted once again. So Marlowe plays hardball, confronts the Bay City police chief saying two of his officers are thugs who are working off duty and beating up citizens. He ends up getting some help from one of them, and he finds out that Malloy may now be hiding. It's the ever elusive Malloy, hiding on a gambling boat that's owned by local gangster and city booster Laird Brunette. This is the big mafioso kind of character in the book. So Marlowe gets out to the gambling ship with the help of an ex-cop named Red and persuades Brunette to get a message to Malloy. So all of a sudden we're back on the mainland. Marlowe connects the dots and sets up the climax, which features himself, Moose Malloy, and a woman, Mrs. Grail, who turns out to not be Mrs. Grail. So should I spoil it here, Kurt, or should I wait till our discussion later?
Let's right now not spoil it, and let's get into. We can talk about the spoiler later as it comes up, because I think we're going to want to talk about the ending of the book.
I think so. We'll get to it, folks. A couple more notes here before I wrap up with my rating. I was surprised by I've read Chandler, and we've read all these old 40s novels, but I was surprised particularly by the unexamined racism in this book. Either Chandler is telling it like it is, quote unquote, to prove a point about the racism of the 1940s, or he's just nonplussed about the racism of the times. Either way, I feel that the regular use of the N-word and disregard for characters, the deaths of black folks in the story by white people, reads as callous, reads as hard-boiled, but hard-boiled in a bad way, if not straight up racist. And while I get the timeliness and I get, you can't judge everything according to modern standards, there's also the racist depiction of Amthor as Native American tough guy. It's just a thing that I feel needs to be addressed. I think there are many people who would act as anti-racist or non-racist in the 1940s, who were people who saw how to behave and how not, and Chandler doesn't appear to be one of them in the context of this novel. Overall, this reads ultimately like a classic Chandler novel. It feels to me like the Big Sleep. It has the same kind of convoluted, weird-ass plot, but it comes together, and it ultimately is an interesting, reflective, and sentimental story featuring our protagonist Marlowe, the knight, the romantic. I sort of see through that romance. I don't quite see him as that like I used to. But it's also a meditation on big power in the little city, as well as the intrigue of several minor characters who I really love. Moose Malloy, Jessie Florian. All of these things make it an ultimately compelling read. I'm not sure if I love Chandler as much as I once did, but I think this is still a worthy read and an important contribution to the canon of classic hardboiled detective fiction. At this point, I'm going to give it 4 hits out of 5. Kurt.
Ooh, Justin, that's interesting. I mean, to say that you're not sure if you love Chandler as much as you once did,
I know.
That's fairly strong.
I know. I don't know how I feel about that. I have to chew on that some more and maybe go back to Dash and go back to Ross McDonald, go back to Kane and just see how all these old timers are sitting with me. Something's clicked in me. Maybe it's the fact that I'm just becoming increasingly intolerant of certain things, or I don't know what it is. What are your thoughts on this book?
Well, I have a lot of, as usual, I have a lot of similar thoughts. But, immediately upon starting this, even if I didn't know who wrote this, I almost feel like or I don't know, if the character was not Philip Marlowe or something, the language, I immediately was immersed back into Raymond Chandler's work. I mean, it's been so imitated, as you said. I mean, there's literally thousands of copycats out there.
Yeah.
As we mentioned before, this is something that has been parodied in everything from cartoons to Star Trek episodes to, all over the place.
Yeah.
Yet, when you go back to his words, it feels different. It has a certain quality to it that you kind of know that this is Chandler. And I appreciated that. And that was my first thought in the opening, sentences, I guess, of the book. And then, like you said, I was immediately struck with, wait a minute, this book is a little bit more racist than I remember Chandler being. And, as you said, we'll get into that topic a little bit. And I think I am also on the same page as you as far as, does that skew how I look at his work at this point? And I don't have a good answer for that either. I'm not sure if this is in the realm of excusable for, a product of its time sort of thing or not. And I think that is a difficult question to answer. And I think that's kind of a question that everybody kind of has to answer on their own, because I don't know, unless there's, some more supporting evidence from Chandler's letters or something, which isn't something I looked into. I think that's a question you have to ask. But it's certainly in this book, and it could be problematic for some people. So it is worth pointing out. Now, that aside, the general plot of this book, I think, is pretty interesting. I love the beginning. I love the end. I'm not so sure about the middle, and I think we'll get into that as we discuss more about this book. But overall, I think my rating on this is probably a 4.5 out of 5.
All right.
But I could be convinced to bring that down a little bit for some of the reasons that you've mentioned and some of my own issues. That said, there's a lot of good lines in here. There's a lot of good prose. There's a lot of good scenes. And it is still a master book of hard-boiled fiction. So that said, I guess we can move along and get more into this.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you rated it a little higher. It makes me want to reread The Big Sleep and see. That was one of the first, if not the first, detective fictions novel that I read. I gave it a five-star review. I'd like to reread it and see what I think a few years later. I've read it twice. What would I feel the third time in the context of Farewell, My Lovely? I don't know. I might put that on one of my 17 stacks of books around my bed and give it a whirl, because I don't remember it being what this book was. But we'll get into that. Let's talk about some of the characters that stood out to us. I mean, we could talk about Marlowe. Let's save him. What about the side characters? And anybody really stand out to you?
Well, I think let's start out with somebody who walks on stage right away. Let's talk about Moose Malloy a little bit. I mean, I think it's a good character. If we were still doing our Puss Walgreen Award, we might give that to Moose Malloy.
Yeah. But
he's too much of a main character in this book to really give him that award. I mean, the name is fun. The character, I think it's something certainly of a stereotype in this kind of thing to have a big brute character like this. But I think in the case of this, it works. I like how he enters the scene in the very beginning, and you think he's going to play a fairly major role throughout the whole plot, and he really doesn't come back until closer to the end of the book. So I like Moose. I think it's a good use of that type of character to not spend too much time with him.
Yeah, he's a bit one track. He's myopic. He has horse blinders on. He's looking for Velma. That's his one personality trait really at this point, other than the fact that he's really strong and a bit sociopathic in his pursuit. He is on the page in the first 10 pages. He's on the page in the last 10. But that doesn't mean that he's not in the book. His presence is felt all the way through. Where's Moose? Moose was here. Where's Moose going to be? Moose might be here. It's like, where's Waldo? And yeah, we're looking for him. We don't find him. If we find him, does it matter? The cops are looking for him. Some bad guys are looking for him. He's looking for Velma. Marlowe is sort of looking for him because he's sort of working for him, but he's not really. Meanwhile, he's getting beat up by other people pursuing other things. He's like a ghost. He hangs over the entirety of the story and ultimately is a tragic figure. As much as Moose, I wouldn't want to hang out with him. It doesn't seem very interesting, and he might kill me. I do feel like he has a heart, and I would argue that he has more heart than Marlowe. I'm sort of disbelieving the notion that Marlowe is the white knight and the romantic sleuth. I get more of an impression that he's disconnected and not really interested in what's happening around him. I'm struggling more, particularly with this book, with the sense that Marlowe is this sort of emotional presence. I don't get that impression. But I felt that I felt that Malloy was, because he has something to lose and to gain, and he yearns for something, and I thought that was interesting.
Since you brought it up, that was one thing I was going into this novel looking for, was this Marlowe is night concept that we talked a lot about in the other episode. And I would have to agree with you. I didn't see the evidence for that in this book. I mean, I know in The Big Sleep, I mean, there was a lot of things in the text that sort of allude to that, the symbolism and whatnot. And you don't see that in this book. So I don't know. I don't know if that comes, I guess we could see down the road if we come back to Chandler again and Marlowe, if that comes back in later works. But it didn't seem to be very present here in Farewell, My Lovely.
The other person that I loved, and I've already mentioned, was Jessie Florian. She's this tragic figure, an alcoholic who is the wife of the former owner of Florian's, which was a white bar, and then it became a black bar, and she was no longer part of it. She's living alone. She drinks a lot. Marlowe comes to pay her a visit and get some information out of her as he searches for Velma. And I just really love their exchange. I love her on again, off again. I don't know. There's a complexity in her spirit. She's very excited when he whips out a bottle of gin or a bottle of whiskey for her, and she gets talkative. And I feel like Raymond was really in tune with her and her drinking. I think Raymond Chandler writes really good alcoholic or drunken characters because he was such a damn alcoholic. Yeah. He knows the scene. He's not playing. And I get the highs and lows, and I just got the impression that she was one of the more well-rounded characters in these novels, and a female character, a woman who was not a femme fatale or a stereotype. Maybe she was a stereotype floozy, but I felt like there was more to her than most of his female characters.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I think it's a pretty interesting character. I think it's a good character for a hard-boiled novel. I think that we could have, like you said, it is a little bit of a stereotype, but at least we get some complexity to that stereotype. Things like she has a connection to Marriott because of their past history. That adds another layer to her past. And that makes her a little bit more nuanced rather than just a drunken former showgirl or whatever. There's layers to what's going on with her, and I enjoyed that, and I think she is she is probably one of the best characters in the book.
And she meets a fate that isn't ideal for her. She gets murdered by Moose Malloy, so that brings those two threads together. Moose doesn't do it on purpose or whatever. He doesn't know his own strength. Obviously, that's not an excuse with murder. You murder. But it adds to the tragedy. It was a mistake, and it seemed sort of like her life. It was just one big mess, and she went out in another messy fashion, and it just disappointing, depressive, but memorable, and I felt something, and that's right around the point where the novel turns and gets complicated with Marriott and Mrs. Grail, and then the drunk house, and then the boat. Then it feels like a James Bond novel. There's a lot of like jumps that almost felt episodic and like an adventure story, or like Star Wars, a rapid pace from scene to scene, chasing something. And there's a lot going on. There's no real time to just breathe and see what's happening. It's like Marlowe on parade a little bit. And you said you had some issues with the middle of the book, and I think that's what I'm addressing a little here too.
Yeah, and I think that speaks also to our discussion of the characters, and I don't know if there was other characters you wanted to bring up, but for the most part, we have a fairly significant cast of characters here. Yeah. But I don't feel like we get to spend a whole lot of time with anybody, because other than, of course, Marlowe, and maybe it's because Florian is one of the few characters that he actually has multiple interactions with that last more than a page or two, that we get a little depth to her, because I feel like all these other people are pretty in and out of the book pretty quickly.
That's true. I mean, think of Dr. Sonderberg. We have this doctor who takes Marlowe in. Is he a hostage? Is he not? Is Sonderberg a maniac? Is he not? we only spend a few minutes with him, and then Marlow's out. We never see or hear of Dr. Sonderberg again. Mm-hmm. When we see Laird Brunette, the big mafioso bad guy on the boat, you think that's going to be some kind of finale, and we're going to get into it with Brunette, and Brunette's going to recur and come after Marlow. We never see him again either.
No.
And maybe this is the stitching together of the stories that Chandler had a habit of, in terms of his procedure for putting together novels. Maybe this is where that stitching becomes revealed, just like we talked about with The Big Sleep. The first half of the novel felt like we were getting to know characters. The second half felt like we were getting a lot of characters, but no depth.
Yeah, and I think that we could go down the list of most of the other characters in this book and say pretty much the same thing. Like, I thought, Anne Reardon gets introduced pretty early in the book, and I thought she was going to play a bigger role, but no. While these characters are interesting characters when they're introduced, we just don't get any time to interact with them, and I think that is one of the reasons why this book, we're I guess struggling with the book a little bit, because I think we would have liked to see more character development.
Yeah, I don't know. I got to chew on it more, but when people say this is one of his best, I go, okay. I mean, it's good for what it is. I'm not swallowing the Kool-Aid. You know what? I didn't swallow the Kool-Aid with Sam Spade either. I think Dash Hammett's stories are better than the one novel that he's best known for, which is the Sam Spade one.
The Maltese Falcon?
Yeah, the Maltese Falcon. So am I coming at it more critically than I should? Is it the 1,000 imitators that have colored my view of Chandler? Because when I read Marlow's pippy one-liners and similes, I sort of roll my eyes and I'm like, oh my God. But he's the guy who invented it. He's the guy who made that the part of detective fiction that it is. And innocently, it's beautiful, and innocently, it's cool. But when I think about all the people who are copycats who have ruined it for me, I can't judge Chandler or Marlowe on that. But I can judge him on lack of character development amongst all these big bads and troublemakers in the middle of the book. Give me a little more Brunette. Give me who's the big bad. And I'm not sure if anybody is. It's the system. Yeah. It's the system that crushes everybody and uses everybody as pulp in a wood chipper.
Yeah, and I mean, to give a counterpoint to it, for me, I enjoyed Marlowe's dialogue. I enjoyed getting going to the, as you kind of said, the source of the detective with the pithy one-liners and good turns of phrase. I enjoyed that. For me, that was probably one of the highlights of the book. And now we've talked extensively about the characters. Should we get into some of these plot elements that maybe we had a little bit of issue with?
Sure. I do want to say one thing. I got over my hesitation with the similes in the language. Ultimately, I came to appreciate a lot of it. There are some choice lines, some beautiful writing. I think part of it is that I also then watched the 1975 version of Farewell, My Lovely, starring Mitchum, and I think I struggle more with these lines being spoken by an actor. It sounds to me more petulant when it's a person saying it than when it's read on the paper, because it feels more natural. It feels like it's better in print for me. So I think that's a little bit of where I'm coming from with that. In terms of like the plotting, just the style, the setting, we're in Los Angeles. We're all over Los Angeles in this book. What are your thoughts on specific plot threads or the style of this book? What stands out to you?
Well,
what did you like the most?
What did I like the most? I liked the opening setup for it. I liked how we got into the story, setting aside some of the issues with how it's presented. But I do, as far as the racist elements go, but I liked how we got into the story. I like how Marlowe once again gets dragged into the case. I do like how he takes two elements that at first seem unconnected and then connects them.
Yeah.
For the most part, I liked how it ended. I liked that where you thought the climax was going to happen isn't where the climax happened. He's going out to this gambling boat, which, interestingly enough, that's a long-standing location for hard-boiled stories. I remember going back to Fast Ones, written by Paul Kane in 1930. Uh-huh. That's a key part of that book. So That's certainly not an original idea to Chandler, but that's where you think the climax is going to happen, and it doesn't. So those are the highlights. What doesn't work for me is sort of the middle of the book. That seems a little bit too contrived. After he goes to the psychic Ampher and gets drugged, that part's a little bit like, come on.
I feel like somebody has to get drugged in every novel over 200 pages that was produced between 1930 and 1947 or whatever. But that's okay. I didn't mind that. Amthor was a weird character. Felt like a stereotype trying to capture this sort of early New Age guru personality type. He didn't leave a strong impression on me. I hated what Chandler did with the quote unquote Hollywood Indian second planting. Maybe it was speaking to current events, but that just felt really uncomfortable and creepy for me as somebody who respects three-dimensional indigenous people as individuals and not as stereotypes. I was pretty embarrassed by that, in fact.
Yeah.
And that colored my feeling about that whole scene.
Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, I think that makes it uncomfortable for the modern reader, because that was, if we're going to address the racism in the book, that part to me was the worst.
Yeah.
And it was the most. The other parts I think were a little bit more excusable from a product of the time kind of thing. But that was just kind of over the top and unnecessary. I mean, I guess you could attempt to make an argument that Chandler was trying to say something by saying that the murder of a black man wasn't going to be investigated, but I'm not really interested in hearing that argument. But this was definitely the most problematic.
I guess I'll speak briefly to the first scene as well. I thought about that too. It's immediately, I'm trying to rationalize Chandler's reasoning, but he does have an avatar. He has Marlowe, and Marlowe could say something. Marlowe could be like, well, this is fucked up, moving on. But he doesn't say anything, and I was looking for research or commentary on Chandler and racism, just to get a sense of the layers of who he was, maybe whether this was just incidental, natural racism because our society was and is racist, or if this is an active move on him because of some racism in him that he carries more intentionally. And a writer and novelist, Elia Dawn Johnson, wrote the following. That was a criticism of this book. Here's the quote. Problem with Farewell, My Lovely is not the black victim at the start of the story. It is the lack of black justice or even an attempt to achieve it. White victims in the novel are mourned. Police corruption affecting hardworking whites is deplored. The unnamed black man, his family, his story never come back. They are an afterthought, a joke, a prelude to the real story. And even Marlowe doesn't spend a moment thinking about it. And that's the killer for me. If he would have just reflected on a dead black body and go, things shouldn't be this way, that would be something. But there was nothing, and that coldness and that callousness was something that was difficult to start the story off with. I was like, God, is this fucking grim and frankly racist? That's what I was sitting with as I read this novel.
I'd have to go back. I'm trying to remember. I thought Marlowe gives Lieutenant Nolte sort of some shit about that, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't want to, I don't want to say something that isn't there. It's not enough, but yeah, I mean that comment of it just being used as a device to get to, as that author said, the main story. I totally agree with that.
So, and of course, people who read this stuff are used to this, the racism, the sexism, the anti-Semitism. It's all part and parcel with hard-boiled fiction, so this isn't singling Chandler out here. But for POC folk, people who are into detective fiction and want to read the classics, go in knowing that you're going to get some of this shit that's blatant and unreflective, and just be mindful of that.
Well, and I think that's one of the things we've said before on this show is that, it's good to look at the classics, but that noir and hard-boiled is not a dead genre. So to read something that is modern, current, and conscious of some of these issues is important, just as important as reading the foundations of the genre and being able to look at them with a modern critical eye.
And the book we're going to review in our next episode will be a nice counterexample to this. It's S.A. Crosby's Blacktop Wasteland, which is focused on Black lives and crime and interesting modern situations. It was released last year. So it'll be interesting to read that again after having read this novel.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I know you've already read it, so I'm definitely looking forward to getting some time on with that one. But moving on, I don't know if there's more you want to say about plot here. We've already kind of moved on to other topics, but one of the things that I was looking at with criticism of this book is talking about the idea of plot through movement, and I think we discussed this a little bit with the other Marlowe book that we looked at. That is definitely prevalent in here. I mean, in part, the reason we don't spend any time with some of these characters is because Marlowe is pretty much constantly moving through this book, and that is what propels the plot along, rather than really the clues or an investigation. It's just that Marlowe keeps stomping on to the next thing. And I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but I can see that.
I agree with that. I feel like it was a tour of LA, and our tour guide was Marlowe. And we rarely backstepped or made loops back around. The only time we return to anything is when we revisit Jessie Florian. Yeah, this is more of a linear journey, just from one stop to the next. And ultimately, in terms of structure, it isn't like, in some novels, you start in one place and you come back to that place changed, or you go to certain points in the story and each point reflects an internal or exterior, or who has access or who doesn't. Each setting serves a function beyond simply getting the characters to interact. And I feel like I didn't see as much of that here. It was more just a choose your own adventure, and this is where Chandler happened to want to lead us. I'm not sure how much thought he put into why we went from one place to the next, but I guess I would have to caveat that by saying we do return to Mr. and Mrs. Grail's house.
Yeah.
But the rest of the time, it's just we stop in, we say hi. Marlowe gets drugged or beat up. We move on to the next joint. And that's okay. It was fine, but I don't know. There was a little something lacking there for me.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, because it is, as you said much earlier in the show, it does feel a little stitched together. But I do think the larger lesson here, if you're looking at this more as a foundational piece or key to the genre, is keeping the plot moving. And I think that's one thing that sometimes I dislike in some of the, I don't know, other types of detective fiction, is where we get really stuck in a particular scene or overly detailed. Keep the action going. That's what we're kind of many of us are here for. So I do appreciate that about Chandler's work. Justin, should we get into the end of this book, how Chandler wraps this all up?
I think we should. I want to say one more thing about Chandler in terms of his structure. He's a guy that cut his teeth on Black Mask stories. And he got it. He cut his teeth by copying some of the masters that preceded him. He didn't start writing into the stuff until he was 45, which makes me feel good because I'm only 43, so there's still hope. And he was an oil executive. He lost his job during the Great Depression. He picked up Black Mask and started copying some of the writers there, including Earl Stanley Gardner. And he learned how to emulate their style, put out a couple stories, and then within a few years, he wrote The Big Sleep. So this was all in the later half of his career. He's a pulp fiction guy. That's how he learned to write. That's what he knows sells. And the 3 stories he used for this novel, I actually have the names of them here. 1 second. The 3 stories were probably published in Black Mask before he stitched them into this story. One of them is called Try the Girl. One of them is called Mandarin's Jade. And the last is The Man Who Liked Dogs. So while he gets props for being the literary detective novelist, he transcends the genre, the hardboiled genre. He transcends pulp. I feel like he does, but he doesn't do it consistently throughout the novel. And I think that's the weird thing. It's like he's there, but he's not there. He's 1 foot in Black Mask and the other foot is in competing with Faulkner and Hemingway. So I feel like that's an odd sort of bipolar thing going on with the Chandler novels that I've read thus far. So that's all I wanted to say before we talk about the ending, which I also enjoy.
Yeah. And the only thing I would say about that is I wonder if we're seeing a little bit of a second novel problem here. I'm curious if some of these things would be ironed out in the 3rd novel, but maybe not. Our ending. So where do you feel like the ending actually, when does this start to climax for our ending? I'm kind of going to say this is when he has his meeting with John Wax, the corrupt police chief of Bay City. Would you say that's kind of when it starts to...
Yeah, well, I feel like we start to move. Amthor doesn't really yield anything.
No.
So there was a lot of dead ends. And I think with the Bay City guy, that's the first time we sort of got to the source. We're thinking, well, maybe it's Laird. Maybe it's this gangster. He's the one that's running this show. He's the big crook. And that's where we're going to get the answers. So I felt like that was where we started to really move instead of aimlessly wandering without answers. We got somewhere. And that propelled us to the gambling ship. And meeting that sympathetic character that we didn't talk about, that guy Red at the port. He's an ex-cop, and he was at the port while Chandler was trying to get a boat. He tried to get onto the gambling ship, and he was rejected. And then this guy Red sort of shows up and says, "Hey, I can take you through the back door." And I thought that was an interesting scene with a character who also I thought had a heart and had depth to him. That was a nice break in between some of these more static, shallow characters.
For sure, and one that we could have gotten a little bit more from, because even though I like this character, when he exits the scene, I'm still sort of thinking, well, why is this? What's going on here? Why is he helping as much as he is?
Yeah,
there could have been a little bit more. Yeah.
Sort of like the character of, what's her name at the beginning?
Anne
Riordan. Like, these helpers come in and they're interesting, or they're really invested in Marlowe's journey. But why are they there? Why are they so helpful? And what do we do with them after? And I feel like that keeps recurring in this story. So, because, Red was a good character, but then he's gone and we never see him again, like a wizard or a fairy godmother who pops in and then snap the fingers, they're gone. They've served the plot. We're now on the gambling ship. Big confrontation with Laird, who ultimately the gangster isn't that mean and is helpful and never recurs. There's no showdown. He doesn't follow Marlowe or get into a fight with him or team up with Malloy. There's no amplifying of the badness of Malloy or Brunette. It's just, well, I'll help you. And then ultimately we get to Malloy in the final few pages.
Yeah, all the gangster guy does there is serve as a very complicated telephone to get Malloy on the line and get in contact with him. That's kind of it. And
yeah, really weird.
And then we go back to Marlowe's apartment.
And that's the big climax. So what happens at this apartment? Marlowe goes back. He has an impression of something. I think at this point he's got shit figured out. He calls Mrs. Grail, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to consummate their relationship, perhaps. They fooled around a little at her house. Her husband saw, no big deal. And then he calls her. She's going to come over. They're probably going to go out and mess around. She comes over. He invites her in. And then what happens?
Marlowe and Mrs. Greeley are having a conversation while Moose is hiding in the closet, basically.
Moose is already there.
Yeah, he's hiding in the closet. She's talking to Marlowe, and basically Moose recognizes that, lo and behold, this is Velma.
Yeah, he hears her voice, and I mean, it's been 8 years, and she's changed her look, but you can't change your voice. So he hops out, and he's like, blinders on. He's like, "Velma, I love you, Velma," and Velma, what's her impression of Moose? He's expendable. Yep. She never loved him. She's the one who ratted him out to the cops to begin with.
Yep.
So she's the classic femme fatale. She's been playing as Mrs. Grail the whole time. And she shoots Malloy, kills him. Shoots him in the chest, shoots him in the heart. He dies. She gets away because she actually takes a shot at Marlowe, but she's out of bullets. Is that accurate?
Yeah, she's out of bullets, and then she runs away, and for some reason Marlowe doesn't try to stop her, or I don't know.
He's got a heart of gold, meaning he's a sucker for women who murder people. I don't know.
Yeah.
But somehow he doesn't pursue her. He's not looking to apprehend the murderer in this case. And then there's this whole sequence of her hitting the road, being on the lam, right?
Yeah, which that's a failure, I think, of the ending, because we get a chapter 3 months later.
Yeah, it's like the denouement that we don't really need. The real scene, the climax, the thing that matters is I mean, but I guess she is the protagonist. Her name's mentioned on the first page. I mean, she's the one with the arc. She's the one playing all these different disguises. She's the one who's ultimately bad, but we think that she's good. And she's the one who meets her fate at the end. But in fact, she gets away, sort of like Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men.
Is there justice here? I don't know. Kind of. It is interesting because it just struck me by saying that multiple times in this book, Marlowe is a witness to a murder and pretty much does very little to stop it or intervene or, well, I shouldn't say intervene, but he could have been more helpful in apprehending the murderer.
I mean, I get that he's world weary, but I've always had the impression that he's world weary with the heart of gold. I feel like in this book, he's world weary with PTSD and clinical depression. Like, I think that maybe deep down he feels these things, but what we see on the page is a guy who just does not have the capacity to invest anything into helping anybody other than supplying them with alcohol so he can get a little information like he does with Florian. I feel like there's a disconnect between him and his emotional core in this novel, and I don't know if that's just me or what, but it's odd. It's surprising.
Yeah, it is. And I kind of think that you might be steering me more towards a 4 out of 5 rating as well for this book. But I don't know. I think that ultimately here, this is a book that it's satisfying to read, especially as a big fan of the genre, because of these complexities that we're bringing up that I think it's worth thinking about. It's worth revisiting this and it's worth looking at because it's been imitated so many times. So how does it stand up? And maybe there's more here, more than we're even seeing right now going on here. Maybe this is a novel about his weariness more than anything else.
Yeah, and that could be true, and it could be the way I'm reading it. I'll read it again, and we still have plenty more Chandler to read as well. And I'll also read Walter Mosley, who also spends time in Los Angeles trying to understand Los Angeles through the prism of a black detective, an amateur, but nonetheless, he does a lot of what Chandler does with Chandler as a primary influence. I like to return and try to understand what Chandler and Marlowe are doing, how this might be misinterpreted or reinterpreted, and who really Marlowe is. Maybe my idea of him in The Big Sleep didn't speak to the fullness of who this character is. And man, he's a complicated, distant, messed up dude. So that's the impression I'm getting. I'd have to read The Long Goodbye again to see what he's like a couple novels later. It's been a while, but I do plan to read through all of them, hopefully in the next couple of years, and see how he evolves, amongst the several novels that were written about him.
Yeah, for sure. And as we've said, much imitated, but also this book has been adapted into 3 different films. Originally as the Falcon series, which, I don't know, that was in 1942. It was a book or a movie called The Falcon Takes Over. Not very well regarded. There's a 1944 version, Murder My Sweet, which is fairly well regarded. I believe that was a British film. That starred Dick Powell as Marlowe. And in 1975 is a movie that we both watched. That's Farewell, My Lovely, starring Robert Mitchum as Marlowe. And what did you think of this film, Justin? Do you think it was a fair adaptation?
I enjoyed it. I think Robert Mitchum does an okay job. Some people said that it was one of his best roles. I think Robert Ebert was all over it. I love the opening scenes, the glitz and neon and grittiness of like a gritty Hollywood scenescape at night. I feel like when I was listening to Mitchum do the Marlowe dialogue, like I mentioned before, it sounded a little more hokey or forced than I imagine when I read it myself. Maybe that was Mitchum, or maybe that was just how I felt when I heard it, but whatever. But like I said, the imagery, the atmosphere, I thought was great. I thought the scene with Jessie Florian was great. I thought the actor who played Moose Malloy, and I don't have all the actors' names in front of me right now, was great. I mean, he looked like, I will never not see Moose Malloy as the guy who played him in the 1975 version. I thought that was a perfect casting. And the scriptwriters replaced Jules Amthor's Swami spiritualism for a whorehouse run by a madam, which I thought was interesting. And I actually liked that scene more than I liked the Jules Amthor,
I would agree,
cosmic space bullshit. So I think that was a step up and a nice move by the screenwriter.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things in the plot that they changed, but I think I liked a lot of the changes that they made in this film, and I would agree with you. That opening scene is when you get the neon, the rundown apartment, and as soon as I hear that wailing trumpet sound, it's like that invokes a real feeling, and I really like that. I believe, and as you said, the Moose Malloy was casted well. I think that's Jack O'Halloran is his name.
Yeah, that's the name.
But yeah, I mean, is it true to the novel? No. Is it a pretty decent adaptation of Philip Marlowe to the screen? Yes. And I also think that they made some changes. I mean, this is still 1975, but they definitely made some changes that removed some of these issues that we had with it. And they at least have a little bit more modern look at it. So I thought it was a pretty decent film. I thought Robert Mitchum was a pretty decent Philip Marlowe. But I will say, you're right. It was almost like when they quoted straight from the book, it was almost like there could have been quote marks on the screen because you could, and I have to say, I watched the film about halfway through reading the book. So some of these quotes I hadn't actually read yet, and I could still say, oh, that must be straight from the book. And just because I didn't quote them earlier, I don't know if you wouldn't mind if I read a couple of quotes here that I enjoyed.
Oh, of course.
And this is probably the most famous line from this book and from the movie. It's, I needed a drink. I needed a lot of life insurance. I needed a vacation. I needed a home in the country. What I had was a coat, a hat, and a gun. I put them on and I went out of the room. It's like, I like that. It's,
Yep.
That's good Marlowe, when he's making statements like that.
Yeah.
And I also like this scene. Now, as you said, this originally comes from the scene with the psychic, but they replaced that with this madam, and she's captured Marlowe, drugged him, and she's questioning him. And she says, I think you are a very stupid person. You look stupid, you're in a stupid business, and you came here on a stupid mission. And then Marlowe says, I get it. I'm stupid. It sank in after a while. I like that.
Yeah.
So Philip Marlowe is definitely a character. I mean, even though we discussed some problems with this novel, it's certainly a cultural icon and something that is influential into pop culture today. And the classic is really worth going back and taking a look at. And as we've discussed, a critical look. So I think we've enjoyed going back to Farewell, My Lovely, and I think I, for one, look forward to reading more Chandler in the future.
Yeah, the next book is The High Window. Maybe we'll get to it in 3 years.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do a Subject Unknown where we blast through the rest of Raymond's key Marlowe books and see how the whole series feels to us.
That might be a good way to go, Justin, is just kind of close out the series by reading them all and discussing the progression of the character. I like that idea.
Sounds like fun.
So what do we have coming up in future episodes here, Justin?
Oh, boy. Well, so we've done Chandler. We're already up to episode 55, Time is Flying, and that's going to be S.A. Cosby's well-regarded book that came out last year, 2020, called Blacktop Wasteland. So that's going to be fun to tangle up with. Following that, we're going to do a 5-round review and then 2 deep dives. We're doing 2 in a row. Dorothy Hughes, The Expendable Man. Remember Dorothy Hughes, Kurt?
Oh, yeah.
How much we loved her,
Yeah.
The book we read a couple years ago. We've talked about revisiting her work. The Expendable Man is next on the list. I can't wait. And then we head down to Miami. A forgotten master, Charles Willeford. I know some of you will be delighted to know that we're going to be hanging out with one of the old hardboiled guys from the 60s and 70s that we missed the first time around. We're going to visit Miami Blues, which I've read and enjoyed. So we'll do that.
Well, that sounds good. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. There is a Facebook group associated with the show, and I think we've actually had quite a bit of discussion on there lately. So that's, if you want to discuss stuff regarding the show or noir fiction, that's probably the best place to go. We also have a Goodreads group. You can find that by going to Goodreads, searching for Point Blank Podcast. And if you want to talk to Justin and I specifically, or have a question, comment, concern, you can email us at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. Until next time.
See you around, people.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.